Okay, so this is the Bible study for 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 16 through chapter 14, verse 23. And the text says, Saul and his son Jonathan and the men with them were staying at Gibeah in Benjamin, while the Philistines camped at Michmash. Raiding parties went out from the Philistine camp in 3 detachments. One turned toward Ophrah in the city of Shual, another toward Beth Haran, and the third toward the borderland overlooking the valley of Zeboim facing the wilderness. Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plow points, mattocks, and axes and sickles sharpened. The price was 2/3 of a shekel for sharpening plow points and mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening forks and axes and for repointing goads. So on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or a spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. Now a detachment of Philistines had gone out to the pass at Michmash. One day, Jonathan, son of Saul, said to his young armor bearer, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron. With him were about 600 men, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod, and was a son of Ichabod's brother Ahitub, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh. No one was aware that Jonathan had left. On each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff. One was called Bozez and the other Seneh. One cliff stood to the north toward Michmash, the other to the south toward Geba. Jonathan said to his young armor bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outposts of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." "Do all that you have in mind," his armor bearer said. "Go ahead, I am with you, heart and soul." Jonathan said, "Come on then, we will cross over toward them and let them see us. If they say to us, wait there until we come to you, we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. "Look," said the Philistines, "the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in." The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor bearer, "Come up to us and we'll teach you a lesson." So Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Jonathan climbed up, using his hands and feet, and his armor bearer right behind him. The Philistine fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer followed, and his armor bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed some 20 men in the area of about a half an acre. Then panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and the field, and those in the outposts and the raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. Saul's lookouts at Gibeah in Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions. Then Saul said to the men who were with him, "Muster the forces and see who has left us." When they did, it was Jonathan and his armor bearer who were not there. Saul said to Ahijah, "Bring the ark of God." At that time, it was with the Israelites. When Saul was talking to the priests, the tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, "Withdraw your hand." Then Saul and all of his men assembled and went to the battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. Those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines, who had gone up with them to their camp, went over to the Israelites and were with Saul and Jonathan. When all the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. So on that day, the Lord saved Israel, and the battle moved on beyond Beth Aven. So remember, you can download PDF copies of this Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive. And you can follow along as we read the questions together and answer these questions about this text. So number one on our study says, what happened in our last week's Bible study? Saul sent most of the men home and retained a small standing army, some with him and some with Jonathan. That happened. So remember, he had mustered the army and volunteers and compelled, remember cutting up the oxen, it compelled everybody to come out, or else their oxen would be cut as well. And so he got a pretty large army, but then last week he sent most of them home and only kept a certain number for a standing army. B, Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost at Geba. That happened. C, the Philistines assembled to fight Israel, and when the Israelites saw that their situation was critical, they hid. That was true. The Israelites had become obnoxious to the Philistines. I remember because of Jonathan's attack. Anyway, Saul was waiting for Samuel, but he did not come. This begins probably the most significant part of the text from last week. E, Saul offered burnt offerings without Samuel. That happened. F, Samuel declared that Saul had not kept the command of the Lord, and now your kingdom will not endure. And so that was the judgment on Saul for going ahead and not waiting for God and waiting for the man of God, Samuel, to arrive for the sacrifice. Number two, what were the Philistines doing in verses 16 through 18? So I think specifically it's important that we point out that's 13, 16 through 18. So the beginning of this text. It says Saul and his son and son Jonathan and the men with them were staying in Gibeah and Benjamin while the Philistines camped at Michmash. Raiding parties went out from the Philistine camp in 3 detachments. One turned toward Ophrah in the vicinity of Shual, another toward Beth-Haran, and the third toward the borderland overlooking the valley of Zeboim facing the wilderness. So they were sending out raiding parties and raiding. Capturing people, probably destroying things, whatever they could do to cause havoc, to make it harder for Israel to fight, I'm sure. Stealing equipment, things like that. Perhaps this was the point when they made sure and got rid of all the blacksmiths. Maybe they were capturing them with the raiding parties. Number three, what do we learn about Israel's army in 13:19 through 22? Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel. So we find out that there wasn't a blacksmith anywhere. We don't know where they all went, whether they'd been killed or captured, or just the Philistines had cornered the market on blacksmithing in the area. But there wasn't any, so they were not able to get actual swords and spears, but instead they were having their farming equipment turned into weapons, sharpened, and it was the Philistines who were doing that. So they were paying their enemy to sharpen their farm implements so that they could have anything to fight with. And it tells us that Saul and Jonathan were the only ones who had a sword or a spear in the entire army, which maybe brings some context to why Jonathan was not as impulsive as it seems to sound, but maybe there was a reason that he felt like he was the one that needed to go and make this right. He and the king, his father, were the only two who actually had any kind of true weapon. Now, all of this is really significant because this the prophets use this situation in analogies throughout the Old Testament when we come to the time of the prophets. Now, remember, this is earlier, before most of the prophets were speaking. Most of the prophets spoke further on in the Old Testament, but this became sort of, so Israel was an agrarian society, not primarily a military society, unlike some of the people that surrounded them. And the idea of beating their farm implements into weapons, or after that was done, turning them back into farm implements, was actually something that the prophets used as an analogy throughout the rest of Israel's history. And that analogy would sort of represented a time of peace versus a time of war. So in Joel 3:10, it says, we have a few references here. In Joel 3:10, it says, beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weaklings say, I am strong. And we've heard that, let the weak say, I am strong. That's even a part of one of the songs that we've sung over the years. In Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4, it says, he will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many people. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. So in Isaiah, so in Joel, we're talking about going to war and doing exactly what they were doing here in 1 Samuel. In Isaiah, he's talking about a time of peace when God will bring about peace, and therefore all the weapons that we have will be turned into farm implements because there's no reason for having a weapon. And so, you know, this is not 2022 where everything's plastic and disposable. I remember my parents had a microwave for 20 years, the same microwave. And a lot of times we buy a microwave for $15 or $25 at Walmart, and it lasts a couple years and we throw it away and buy a different one. They didn't do that. If they had a metal object and they didn't need it for that purpose anymore, they turned it into something else because they had a metal object, and that was not as common. So Micah 4:3 says, he will judge between many peoples and will settle disputes for strong nations far and wide. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore, which sounds like very similar words to what we saw in Isaiah. And these are proclamations of peace. And so remember that the prophets had a tendency to warn Israel of what was coming, which was not good, because of their disobedience. That was their primary job. But in almost every one of those warnings, they finished off by bringing hope that there would be a time where God was again, where Israel, where God's people were again surrendered to him, and therefore he had his way, which is actually peace. His desire is peace. And so when that happens, people won't need their weapons anymore. And so that's one of the biggest sort of messianic declarations when we find that in scripture, is that Jesus would bring about peace, because he was resolving the conflict and he was becoming the righteous judge. So I don't think that's the main point of First Samuel, but I do think it's significant. So sometimes when we're reading through a text, I can spend all our time on the main point here in First Samuel, but I think when we hear of something that's going on, the Israelites knew their history. The Israelites knew what had happened and how God had worked in the past. So when the prophets spoke, they used things that Israel knew from their history or from God's interaction with them in the past as metaphors for what was to come. And so this thing that was going on in Israel's history right now is they're in the promised land, but they did not wipe out all of the residents who had lived there before. And so they're living intermixed and interspersed with people that had lived there before, which God had already said was going to be a problem. And these Philistines in particular were a constant problem for the Israelites. And in the midst of that, we find this need to go to war, and the need to go to war without any weapons, because they were not equipped and prepared for war, because they were not primarily a war-making nation. And so then they couldn't get implements made because they had no blacksmiths. And so then now, what are they going to do? Well, they're going to turn their farm implements into, and this becomes a symbol for war, for the future of Israel, and turning those farm implements, those weapons back into farm implements, became a symbol for God, for peace that God has brought about, because he has become the righteous judge and judged between people and brought about peace. And so even though that isn't the primary point of this text, I do think it's important for us to stop and just recognize that this moment and what's going on in this text in this moment becomes sort of representative, that they look back to this as a symbol of war or peace, this action that they were taking here. So it's sort of a, if we're gonna, let's stop for a minute and say, okay, we're not gonna learn, this may be not farm implements and weapons may not have great application to our lives, but learning this point here in this moment, what it does is it helps us know scripture and know the history of God's people better, so that when we read another text in the future, we understand what he's talking about. We say, hey, I remember when we talked about that. I remember when that actually happened, and how God is using that as a part of his message to Israel at this time. And so we do more. I do believe every Bible study that we do should have application to our lives. And so I don't want to miss that. And we're going to move on, and we're going to try to apply the rest of this text to our lives. But at the same time, I do think it's significant for us to use what we read and sort of stop and make a point of it, so that in the future, when we read something else, we'll understand what God is trying to say to us then. And so that's what that moment, this question, was about. Number 4, what does Jonathan do in 14:1 through 10? So we know about how they're going to war, and they're still seemingly afraid and hidden. There were people still hidden. There were people who had been captured or had surrendered and went over to the Philistines, it tells us in a future part of this text here. But Jonathan in chapter 14 does something that seems kind of crazy. So what does he do? He left the camp without anyone realizing he was gone, and without telling Saul, which is generally a bad idea in any military I've ever heard of. That's not a good idea. One, because you're out there on your own. 2, because you're probably disobeying orders, and that's not a good thing. B, he decided to cross battle lines to check out the Philistine outposts with only one other person, his armor bearer. C, he crossed a narrow space between 2 cliffs, which sounds like a very exposed approach. So this was his plan. he's going to cross. There's this narrow space between two cliffs that is in between him and the camp, and he's going to walk across it. And it says he's going to show himself. Come, let us, come on, we will let them see us. So D says, he said, let's go. Maybe God will act on our behalf. Now, I will say that the way that's stated sounds a little bit like testing God. So I want to be careful. I'm hoping that Jonathan had actually heard from God and felt that this was the right thing to do, and God would have him do this, and he wasn't just doing it on his own and testing God, because if he just went out on his own, maybe God will act on our behalf, then that sounds a little dangerous. We're told not to test God. However, maybe this wasn't testing God, but rather stepping out in faith. Maybe it was God did want him to do that, and he felt like it. And he even sort of what we would call puts out a fleece, which is a reference to Judges, to see. So he says, if they say this, we'll know that God has handed them over to us. If they say this, then we're not going to go. And so he kind of puts out a fleece there saying, I think God wants us to do this. We're going to find out. We're going to do this. He said, come on, we will let them see us, which, by the way, is not usually a good battle tactic. Come on, we're going to go across in a very exposed position and let them see us and see what they do. And if they say, hold on, let us come down there to meet you, then we will realize God has not told us to go up, and we won't go up. But if they say, come on, we're going to teach you a lesson, which is what they said, he doesn't say that lesson part, but he says, if they tell us to come up, then we'll come up and we'll know that God has given them into our hands. So presumably, if the Philistines came down to them, if they're going into this narrow area, maybe this was a good idea. If they're going into the narrow area, they're not letting the Philistines come through that narrow area and widen out, but rather they'll be here, and while the Philistines are coming down to meet them, the armies can come up behind them, and if they're outnumbered, then maybe meeting in this narrow space would be a better spot. I don't know. I'm just considering that maybe this wasn't as reckless and crazy as it seemed, that if the Philistines came down, then they would be meeting each other on a more even terms because it was in this narrow area. Whereas if they called them up, which seems like would be likely, if the Philistines were good tacticians and they saw that this was not going to be to their advantage, and they would rather have their full army up there against two guys, then maybe this is better. And so maybe that's why they did it. Maybe it was likely. But Jonathan decided that if they say this, then we know that God has given them over into our hands and he's going to help us. So we're going to go up. F, he said, if the Philistines tell him to climb up to them, then they will know what God has given, that God has given the Philistines into their hands, and they would go ahead and climb up. Wait, what? Now, I don't know how all this factors in to the idea that this was an exposed position because they were up higher. So this seems like I don't know whether they were coming across the cliff and the cliffs were down here, or if they were coming through between two cliffs. I'd like to see perhaps it would have been helpful if Samuel had drawn us a picture to let us know. But either way, this seems like a very strange thing for Jonathan to do, which either was outlandish and crazy or required a great deal of faith and trust in God. Now, given how it seems to go, I think we are to assume that God was with them and it required a great deal of trust in God, and it wasn't as crazy as it might seem on the surface. So number 5 says, so was this brave or stupid or faith? So he was either brave, which doesn't necessarily mean God was involved, or he was stupid, or this was faith. Now, this is an important question, because when we do things like this in our life, when we step out in faith, if God is not involved, it's not stepping out in faith. It is either brave or stupid. It's either, you think you can handle yourself and you're brave and maybe a little arrogant. If it crosses over into arrogance, it's also crossing over into stupidity, because you're taking unnecessary risk. But if you don't know what the will of God is, then if I'm trying to, if you do something that looks crazy and I don't know what God's will is, then I may immediately think it's stupid. Maybe I'll think in the positive that it's brave, but how do I know whether it's brave or stupid or faith? And I would argue this, that somebody that is following the will of God, people around them will regularly have to ask this question: is she brave, or is she stupid, or is God leading her and this is amazing faith that God will come through even though it doesn't make sense, even though this seems like a dangerous endeavor? And so I would say this, that I think the outcome and the sort of keys in the text would lead us to believe that this is faith. But in the absence of really knowing from God, whether it doesn't say that Jonathan, led by the Holy Spirit, went out. It just says he said, let's go do this. This is what we're going to do. And so I would say that if you're Jonathan, you better know for sure, because otherwise this is either brave or stupid. If Jonathan knows for sure and this is faith, then everybody around him don't necessarily know for sure. And if we are trying to judge our brother, which we do quite often, for better or for worse, in love, I think God calls us to make judgments, but sometimes we don't do it in love. And if we're to look at our brother or sister and try to evaluate, I would say it's pretty common for us to make wrong evaluations, because these 3 things might look very similar in practice unless we know what God has said. So A says, well, if you ask me, Jonathan seems pretty impulsive. He's the one that attacked and got them into this situation to begin with. And that was our last text, and that's true. It seems very impulsive, the things that Jonathan is doing. B, well, he said that God will save them, so that sounds like faith. So he is saying maybe God will save us, maybe God will deliver us. But I know people that say that who are just testing God and don't really know that this is God's will. So we got to be careful with that too. See, I don't know. Sometimes it's hard to tell. I guess it all depends on what God's will was in the midst of it, whether Jonathan was guided by God. So this is the real question, isn't it? Was Jonathan guided by God in this? I think what the notes in the text would lead us to believe that this was all of God and this was an act of faith. But I think it's reasonable to point out that if God wasn't involved, then this would be stupid or perhaps very brave. And it is hard to tell from the outside, unless we decide, well, this was in the Bible, so it must be faith, it must be good. But we don't have that luxury when we're dealing with people all around us. And some people say they're people of faith, but I think they test God and they don't do what God says. They put themselves in difficult positions regularly and can't figure out why God doesn't come through, and it's because he hasn't called them. Some people know that God is calling them and they don't step out, and they do that. They don't step out because they think it's stupidity, or they don't think that they're that brave, when it wouldn't require bravery and it wouldn't be stupidity. It would be faith, because God has already said. Number 6, so then what was the outcome according to verses 11 through 14? And again, this is 14, 11 through 14, in case that's confusing. So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. The men at the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor bearer, "Come up and let us teach you a lesson." So they went up. And it says, in that first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about a half an acre. So in a half an acre, which is larger than a normal city plot of land, they killed 20 people, just the two of them. But it's a decent size area. For reference, our valley property is a little over 17 acres. So those of you that have been there, then there are 1/34 more or less of that property. So if you divide it in thirds, and so thirds would probably mean from the office over to the east would be about a third, then a tenth of that. So I would say probably the front yard of the valley property, from the office over to the chapel, would be about an area of half an acre, more or less. That's kind of a guess, but it's close enough for us to say that for us to visualize. I don't remember in number 5 if I read D, where it says, let's wait and see the outcome, and then maybe we'll know if God was really in it. Sometimes from the outside, that's the only way you can know, is if the outcome comes out, if it looks like God was in it, if he brought success, then it might seem like he's in it. Now, I don't think that's a perfect measure, but I think it's a decent measure. And so then number 6 we just read. So then what was the outcome? Well, they were victorious and they were not killed, which is probably the most key part. And then moving on, that struck panic in the Philistines. So number 7 says, how did the story end in 15 through 23? Basically, the Philistines were afraid. This one guy, 2 guys with the sword, who were fighting basically an entire army, was so successful in this one attack that it scared the Philistines to death. Never mind that most of Israel probably would not have had that impact, that most of them were probably not as well trained and well equipped as Jonathan, but it scared them to the point that when Israel came together, mustered the forces, God was on their side. There was a panic. There was a shaking of the army, and Israel won this battle, and even people who had been hiding joined the pursuit to be a part of it. And then number 8 says, so what should we take from this story and apply to our lives? Do a bunch of stupid stuff, and God will take care of you. That's not probably it. I don't believe that that Jonathan did random stupid things. I really believe that Jonathan did what was the will of God, and God blessed it, and God worked through it. And so I would say what we need to apply to our lives is don't do stupid things, and don't just be randomly brave, because you don't really have anything to be brave about. But if God tells you to do something, even if it looks stupid, believe that God could be in it and trust him enough to do it, even if it looks stupid.